Good afternoon, Southminster scholars. Well, it's Monday, September 21, and I want to give one more shout out for the 2020 Southminster Community Fund campaign. I mentioned last time that one of the recipients is the Queen's Learning Society, Queen's University, and this year's keynote speaker is Doris Kearns Goodwin. Many of you know her from the fabulous book No Ordinary Time, Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt and the Home Front during World War II. She's written two others on Lyndon Johnson, Theodore Roosevelt, but the biggest one perhaps was Lincoln's Team of Rivals. But anyway, she's going to be here on November 17th in Charlotte, and she's going to be speaking on the 2020 election. Where do we go from here? She is a dynamite speaker. And because we contribute to the Learning Society out of our community fund, we get to live stream it. So just watch for future info, but save the date, November 17th. And one other reminder, this is the same fund that pays for residents to remain among us should, God forbid, they outlive their money. And there are 10 of us in that strait right now. Costs Southminster $700,000 a year, but that's real peace of mind knowing we will be taken care of. And this is the fund that helps do that. Campaign ends September 30. We're just about out of time. Contributions are tax deductible, and we're hoping for a strong finish. Any questions, you can give Tracy McGinnis, Director of Philanthropy, a call. Well, today we're into the Lincoln Assassination trial, and there were parts of this thing that I had no knowledge of. All of us are familiar with the assassination of Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth, but we sometimes forget that Lewis Powell entered the home of Secretary of State William Seward, stabbing him several times, although Seward survived. Another conspirator, George Atzerodt, was to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson, but lost his nerve at the last minute. And one more, a fourth, Michael O'Laughlin, was to kill General Grant, but he also lost his nerve. But there are two others, other names we do remember: Mary Surratt, her boarding house, and Dr. Samuel Mudd, who set Booth's broken leg as he leapt onto the stage. A frantic investigation was begun and slowly began identifying and rounding up the conspirators. I'll let Professor Linder lead us through that and the trial that followed, but in it, watch for the original plan, not to kill Lincoln, but to kidnap him. Watch for the dispute, whether the trial should be in civil court or in a military tribunal, and the reasons for choosing a 9-person military tribunal. Watch for the length of the trial, 7 weeks, and the large number of witnesses, 371. Watch for the defenses mounted by the lawyers for the 8 defendants. Watch for the overwhelming incriminating evidence produced by the prosecutors. Watch for the verdict reached after 1 day of deliberation. Watch for the surprise when Mary Surratt was one of the 4 sentenced to be hung, and why. And finally, watch for what happened to the 4 conspirators sentenced to prison.
What happened at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. on April 14, 1865 is known to all students of American history. At 10:15, as President Lincoln and his wife watch the play Our American Cousin, John Wilkes Booth enters the presidential box. From a distance of 4 feet, Booth fires a bullet into the president's brain. He leaps from the mezzanine to the stage and dashes toward the back door. A theater stagehand named Edmund Spangler opens the door for Booth. He rushes out to a waiting horse, sweeps down the alley, and disappears into the darkness. What many people do not know, however, are the other events tied to the Booth's conspiracy that occur that same day. Many people do not know that as Booth fires his fatal shot, 2 men on horseback approach the home of Secretary of State Seward. They have assassination on their minds. One of the men, Lewis Powell, slashes a bodyguard with a knife and races to the bedroom where the secretary lies in bed. Powell stabs him several times, shouting, "I'm mad, I'm mad." He rushes down the stairs to find that his fellow conspirator, David Harold, has already fled the scene. He must make his getaway alone on unfamiliar city streets. Also on the 14th, another conspirator, assigned the job of assassinating Vice President Andrew Johnson, lurks around Washington. George Atzerodt rents a room at the Kirkwood House where the vice president is staying and asks a desk clerk about Johnson's whereabouts. He brings with him a loaded revolver, a Bowie knife, and 3 handkerchiefs. To Booth's dismay, Atzerodt can't bring himself to do the job. In yet another part of the capital, Michael O'Loughlin drinks and drinks at a hotel bar. Like Atzerodt, he disappoints Booth. His mission, the government prosecutors will later allege, was to assassinate General Ulysses Grant. But at the most, the evidence suggests O'Loughlin scouted out the home of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Mary Surratt, the owner of a boarding house in Washington, is busy on the 14th. Surratt travels to a Maryland tavern to make a delivery. The buggy she rides in has been rented for her by John Wilkes Booth. She carries with her a package that Booth will pick up after he shoots the president. The eventful day ends about midnight with the arrival on horseback of John Wilkes Booth and David Harold at the tavern visited hours before by Mary Surratt. Harold bursts into the tavern and grabs 2 carbines and a bottle of whiskey. He passes the bottle to Booth, takes a swig or two, and then they're off. They head towards the farm of Dr. Samuel Mudd, and at some point during the night, whether in leaping from Lincoln's theater box or in a fall from his horse, Booth has fractured his leg. Mudd treats Booth's leg and constructs for him a pair of crude crutches. This skeleton of the story shows that the assassination of Abraham Lincoln was part of a larger conspiracy, one that involved many men and women and evolved over weeks. In fact, some people believe the conspiracy reached to the very top of the Confederate government. That certainly was the theory of the prosecutors in the Lincoln assassination conspiracy trial. Hours after the president was shot, investigators, under the direction of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, started to focus on the boarding house of Mary Surratt. Booth was known to have stayed at the house during his visits in Washington. Military investigators roused Surratt from her bed about 4 in the morning on the 15th and questioned her about Booth's whereabouts. When the investigators left, Surratt reportedly told her daughter, "Anna, come what will, I am resigned. I think J. Wilkes Booth was only an instrument in the hands of the Almighty to punish this proud and licentious people." 2 days later, shortly after 11 at night, a team of military investigators again arrived at the Surratt home. While they interviewed Mary Surratt, a man knocked at the door. It was Lewis Powell, the conspirator who assaulted Secretary of State Seward with a knife. Powell was carrying a pickaxe. Asked by the investigators what he was doing there, Powell claimed, improbably, to have been hired to dig a gutter. Mary Surratt refused to back up his story. She told investigators, "Before God, sir, I do not know this man, and I have never seen him, and I did not hire him to dig a gutter for me." While in the Surratt home, investigators uncovered various pieces of incriminating evidence. They found, for example, a picture of John Wilkes Booth hidden behind another picture on the mantelpiece. Facing arrest, Surratt asked a minute to kneel and pray. So Surratt and Powell were both taken into custody. William Bell, Secretary Seward's servant, identified Powell as the man who had stabbed the secretary. The investigation produced 3 more arrests that same day. Edmund Spangler was arrested after investigators gathered reports from theatergoers suggesting that he had aided Booth's escape from Ford's Theater. Samuel Arnold was arrested in Virginia after he was determined to have been the author of an incriminating letter found in a search of the trunk at Booth's hotel room. In his letter to Booth, Arnold had written, "You know full well the government's suspicion something is going on here. Therefore, the undertaking is becoming more complicated." Arnold's arrest helped break the conspiracy case. He identified 7 individuals he met the previous month when the plan was to kidnap, not to kill, the president. Yes, the assassination conspiracy of April 14th was Plan B. Plan A, probably backed by the Confederate government in Richmond, was to kidnap Lincoln and take him behind Confederate lines to Richmond. The idea was to release Lincoln only when the Union agreed to release captured Confederate soldiers. The plan fell through, though, when Lincoln changed plans on the day that the plot was to be executed. Arnold's tip then led to the arrest of O'Laughlin and Azeroth. When first interviewed by investigators, Dr. Samuel Mudd said that the man whose leg he fixed was a stranger to him. A search of Mudd's home 3 days later turned up a left foot riding boot with the name John Wilkes Booth in it. Mudd claimed not to have noticed the writing. He also claimed not to recognize a photo of Booth. But investigators knew from talking to Mudd's neighbors that Mudd and Booth had been seen together that previous November. So Mudd became the 7th conspirator arrested. On the 26th of April, then, 12 days after the assassination, investigators closed in on their main prey. Booth and Harold were hiding in a barn in Virginia. The suspects were told to get out or the barn would be set on fire. Booth tried to bargain, but failed. Pine boughs were placed against the barn. Booth yelled, "There's a man who wants to come out." David Harold stepped out of the barn and was apprehended. With the fire raging around him, Booth appeared at the door of the barn. He carried a carbine. A shot rang out, and Booth fell. He was carried into the farmhouse, where he died 2 hours later. With the arrest of Harold, the government had in its custody the 7 men and 1 woman it would try for the conspiracy to murder the president and other officials. But how and where should they be tried? Secretary Stanton favored a quick military trial and execution. Edward Bates, Lincoln's former attorney general, disagreed. He favored a trial in a civilian court. Bates argued that the use of a military trial would be unconstitutional. Bates said, "If the offenders are done to death by that tribunal, however truly guilty, they will pass for martyrs with half the world." President Johnson asked his own Attorney General, James Speed, to prepare an opinion on the legality of a military trial. Speed concluded that the use of a military court was lawful and proper. He reasoned that the attack on the commander-in-chief came before the full cessation of the rebellion by the Confederate States, and thus the assassination was a war crime. It's true that by April 14th, General Lee had surrendered for the Army of Northern Virginia, but the Confederate States of America had not formally ceased hostilities. As an act of war then, Speed said, the War Department, and not the judicial branch, was the appropriate body to run the trial. Johnson agreed, and on May 1, 1865, he ordered the alleged conspirators to be tried before a 9-person military commission. The commission convened for the first time a week later in a newly created courtroom on the 3rd floor of the old Arsenal Penitentiary in Washington. The voting members of the commission included 8 generals and a colonel. Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt served in the problematic dual roles of chief prosecutor and legal advisor to the commission. John A. Bingham served in the commission as a special judge advocate, and both examined witnesses and gave the government's summation. Testimony began on May 12th. Now, that's just 3 days after the prisoners were first informed of the charges against them and asked if they would like to have legal counsel. Apart from this distressingly short time to prepare for trial, the defendants had other things stacked against them as well. Under the rules of the commission, they would be convicted by a simple majority vote, and a majority of 2/3 can impose the death penalty. Also, while their lawyers could call witnesses on their behalf, the defendants themselves were not allowed to testify. The military trial would take 7 weeks. The commission heard from 371 witnesses. Over the course of it all, spectators lucky enough to get admission passes freely moved in and out of the courtroom. A surprisingly nonchalant atmosphere for such a very important trial. The War Department saw the trial as an opportunity to prosecute not only the 8 charged conspirators, but also Jefferson Davis and the Confederate Secret Service. Prosecutors suggested that as the war turned in favor of the Union, the Confederacy got desperate. They began to support schemes that would have been rejected under other circumstances. Witnesses described Confederate plots to destroy public buildings, burn steamboats, poison the public water supply of New York City, and even mount a biological attack. Witness Godfrey Hyams described a meeting with Confederate operatives who hoped to infect clothing in Bermuda with yellow fever, smallpox, and other contagious diseases. Under this plan, 8 trunks of the infected clothing would have been given to or sold to Union troops, while 1 trunk would have been placed in a valise and presented to President Lincoln. Hyams told the tribunal that the operation's mastermind, a Dr. Luke Blackburn, promised him $60,000 for his role in distributing the infected goods. But Hyams testified that he developed qualms about his role. He refused to deliver the infected trunk as a donation to President Lincoln. He did, however, place the other 8 trunks in channels of distribution near concentrations of Union soldiers. A few of the trunks of infected clothing were auctioned off near a Union base of operations in North Carolina. Shortly thereafter, nearly 2,000 citizens and soldiers died in an area during a massive yellow fever outbreak. In a summation, Special Judge Advocate John Bingham attributed the epidemic to the Confederate plot. He did not know, nor did anyone at the time, that mosquitoes, not people, spread yellow fever. What is the relevance of this testimony to the guilt or innocence of the 8 defendants? Not much. It shows how much prosecutors hope to use this trial to completely discredit the Confederacy in the eyes of the public. If he had only been in custody at the time, John Bingham would have put Jefferson Davis in the dock. As it was, Bingham effectively tried Davis in absentia. He presented evidence, some of it highly questionable, that Davis approved of the assassination plot and authorized the use of funds from a Confederate bank account in Montreal to pay for it. In a summation for the government, Bingham went so far as to claim that, quote, Jefferson Davis is as clearly proven guilty of this conspiracy as John Wilkes Booth, by whose hand Jefferson Davis inflicted the mortal wound upon Abraham Lincoln. Apart from the testimony about wide-ranging schemes to terrorize the North, the prosecution presented evidence of not just one plot against Lincoln and the other leaders, but 2. The first plot was that abandoned plot to kidnap Lincoln. There were also evolving plans on exactly how to pull that off, and getting him from Washington to Richmond was never going to be very easy either. As fantastic as it seems, Booth's initial idea was to kidnap Lincoln at, yes, Ford's Theater. In Samuel Arnold's statement, he said his role in the plot would have been to catch the president when he was thrown out of the box at the theater. Actor Samuel Chester testified that Booth tried to recruit his participation in the plot beginning as early as November 1864. Chester said that Booth offered him money in exchange for his proposed role, upon a signal to open a door at the rear of the stage. By April of 1865, the facts on the ground had changed to the point where success for any kidnapping plot became all but impossible. Booth gave up on the idea of kidnapping Lincoln and began thinking about how best to kill him. For the defendants Arnold and O'Laughlin, their main line of defense in the trial was that while they were on board with the kidnapping plot, they did nothing whatsoever to further the assassination plot. Arnold's attorney argued that Arnold, quote, backed out of this insane scheme of capture about the middle of March. There's a problem with that argument, of course. The military tribunal would not look too kindly on people who, even for a while, supported a plot to kidnap the president. O'Laughlin had an additional problem. How did he explain away the prosecution witness who put him at the war secretary's home the night before the assassination? Each of the 8 defendants played different roles in the assassination conspiracy. The evidence of guilt for each was different as well. The guilt of Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Atzerodt was clear almost beyond question. There was simply no conceivable way that any of these men could win acquittal, and a death sentence for each was an all but foregone conclusion. Which is not to say defense attorneys didn't give it their best shot. Take William Doster, who represented Lewis Powell, who attacked the Secretary of State. Doster argued Powell's life should be spared because he suffered from a fanaticism that bordered on insanity. He lives in that land of imagination, Doster said, where it seems to him legions of Southern soldiers wait to crown him as their chief commander. Doster described Powell as an innocent farm boy turned assassin by circumstances beyond his control. We know now that slavery made him immoral, that war made him a murderer, and that necessity, revenge, and delusion made him an assassin. Doster ended his eloquent plea for Powell's life by asking the commission to let him live, if not for his sake, but for our own. Doster also represented George Atzerodt, but his line of defense for this client was a little different. I intend to show, Doster told the commission, that this man is a constitutional coward, that if he had been assigned the duty of assassinating the vice president, he could never have done it. Doster even presented defense witnesses who described Atzerodt as a notorious coward and as a man remarkable for his cowardice. While David Harold's attorney, Frederick Stone, placed his slender hope for saving Harold's life on his client's simple-mindedness and youth. One defense witness said of Harold, "In mind, I consider him about 11 years of age," which for Stone showed that Harold was, quote, only wax in the hands of a man like Booth. Ford's theater stagehand, Edmund Spangler, played only a bit part in this plot. Unfortunately for him, prosecutors had several witnesses who made his willing participation seem likely. For example, a props man for the theater testified that he saw Booth enter the back door of the theater and asked Spangler, "Ned, you'll help me all you can, won't you?" Spangler's defense attorney, Thomas Ewing, argued that while the prosecution evidence might suggest that Spangler agreed to assist Booth, it failed to prove that Spangler was aware of Booth's guilty purposes. He had a point. If any of the 8 defendants was overcharged by the prosecution, it was Ned Spangler. The cases against the other 2 defendants, Dr. Samuel Mudd and Mary Surratt, were circumstantial and are the most controversial. First, Mudd. The prosecution showed that though through the testimony of several witnesses that Mudd and Booth enjoyed a much closer relationship than the doctor would admit. Witnesses placed the 2 men together in Maryland. They testified that Mudd helped Booth buy a horse, most likely the very horse that Booth used in his flight from Ford's theater. A minister testified that he saw Mudd enter Mary Surratt's home in early March. Then, of course, there were Mudd's denials and lies to investigators. Investigator Alexander Lovett testified that Mudd appeared suspicious from the start. When we first asked Dr. Mudd whether two strangers had been there, he seemed very much excited and got pale as a sheet of paper and blew about his lips like a man frightened at something he had done. 3 witnesses, including 2 of Mudd's own slaves, testified that Mudd was a hardcore racist who wished the president dead. But defense attorney Thomas Ewing argued that Mudd's only prior encounter with Booth had been the one in November, and that all the other alleged meetings were fabrications of prosecution witnesses. Ewing contended that it was no crime to fix a broken leg, even if it was the leg of a presidential assassin. Ewing argued that the prosecution failed to prove that his client actually furthered the conspiracy in any way. Prosecutors responded by noting that Mudd pointed out to Harold and Booth the route that they should take upon leaving Mudd's farm. That, said the prosecutors, furthered the conspiracy. No defendant's case, however, was more contested and more debated than that of Mary Surratt. President Andrew Johnson called her the keeper of the nest that hatched the egg. Without question, Booth and other conspirators had been frequent visitors at Surratt's boarding house. But evidence of association with conspirators is not by itself enough to sustain a conviction. Prosecutors had to show that Surratt took specific actions that furthered the conspiracy. It is clear that she lied to investigators. Police witnesses testified she claimed not to know Lewis Powell after he stumbled into her home. But lying is not enough for a conviction either. The most incriminating evidence against Surratt came from 2 witnesses, Lewis Whiteman and John Lloyd. Whiteman, a boarder at Surratt's house, described a buggy trip with Mary Surratt on the afternoon of the assassination to Surratt's Tavern in Maryland. The tavern was part of a farmhouse where Mary had previously lived with her husband, John. John had died in 1862, and Mary had rented out the tavern when she opened her D.C. boarding house in 1864. Ostensibly, the purpose of the buggy trip was to collect a debt, but the real reason appears to have been to deliver a package to the tavern proprietor, John Lloyd. The package contained field glasses, that is binoculars we call them today, although Whiteman said he didn't know the contents at the time. Whiteman testified that while Mrs. Surratt went inside, he bided his time outside and in the bar. When Lloyd showed up, he and Surratt had a conversation in what Whiteman called low tones. He could not make out what they said. Whiteman also told the tribunal that later that evening, only an hour before the assassination, John Wilkes Booth showed up for a final time at Surratt's boarding house. After the visit, according to Whiteman, Surratt's demeanor changed. She became very nervous, agitated, and restless. But the most damning evidence against Surratt came from John Lloyd himself. He testified that 5 to 6 weeks before the assassination, David Harold, George Atzerodt, and Mary's son, John Surratt Jr., dropped off 2 carbines and ammunition at his tavern. Lloyd testified that 3 days before the assassination, Mary Surratt told him that the shooting irons left at his place by the men would be needed soon. And then on the day of the assassination, Surratt again brought up the subject, according to Lloyd. When I got home, I found Mrs. Surratt there. She told me to have those shooting irons ready that night. There would be some parties who would call for them. She gave me something wrapped in a piece of paper, which I took upstairs and found to be a field glass. She told me to get 2 bottles of whiskey ready, and that these things were to be called for that night. Surratt's attorney, Frederick Aiken, argued that Lloyd's evidence should be disbelieved because Lloyd admitted to drinking heavily on the afternoon of the assassination. According to a bartender called as a defense witness, Lloyd was drinking right smartly. Moreover, said Aiken, Lloyd was motivated to exculpate himself by placing blame on Mary Surratt. On the second point, there is little doubt. Lloyd almost certainly faced a choice between either testifying against Surratt or being charged himself. Finally, Aiken argued there was no direct evidence that Surratt knew Booth planned to assassinate the president. Aiken suggested that Surratt may have unintentionally aided Booth's escape, but that nothing she did showed an intent to further a murder. From the standpoint of the commission, Surratt had a problem. They clearly believed that Booth let Surratt in on his plans for Ford Theater. If that were true, then Mary Surratt could have gone to the authorities and prevented the assassination of the president. She chose not to do that. On May 29, 1865, the military commission met in secret session to review the evidence. After a day of deliberations, they reached their verdicts. The commission found 7 of the prisoners guilty of at least one of the conspiracy charges. Ned Spangler was guilty only of aiding and abetting Booth's escape. He got 6 years. Arnold, Mudd, and O'Laughlin were sentenced to hard labor for life. Powell, Atzerodt, Harold, and Surratt were sentenced to be hanged by the neck until dead. The commission sent its recommendations to President Johnson for his review. 5 of the 9 commission members recommended, because of her age and sex, that the president reduce Mary Surratt's punishment to life in prison. Johnson approved all of the commission sentences, including the death sentence for Surratt. And on July 6th, the 4 condemned prisoners were told they would hang the next day. Surratt's lawyers mounted a frantic effort to save their client's life. They hurriedly prepared a petition for habeas corpus, arguing that the tribunal that tried Surratt was unconstitutional. The morning of the scheduled execution, Surratt's attorneys succeeded in convincing a federal district judge to issue the requested writ, but the victory was short-lived. President Johnson quashed the effort to save Surratt when he issued an executive order suspending the writ of habeas corpus in cases such as this. At 1:30 on a hot afternoon, July 7th, 1865, the traps of the gallows installed in the courtyard of the old Arsenal building was sprung. Almost no one expected Mary Surratt to be among the 4 prisoners on the platform. But she was, becoming the first woman ever executed by the United States. The surviving prisoners were taken to prison at Fort Jefferson in the desolate Dry Tortugas, Florida. 2 years later, a yellow fever epidemic swept the prison and claimed the life of O'Laughlin. On March 1, 1869, the last full day of President Johnson's term, Mudd, Arnold, and Spangler received pardons. Now, over the years, critics have attacked the verdicts, the sentences, and the procedures of the 1865 Military Commission. Without a doubt, the trial fell far short of the usual standards for fairness in criminal trials. On the other hand, the commission members clearly did weigh the evidence and made distinctions between levels of guilt. This was an unusual conspiracy, and these were unusual times. The government had strong reasons to seek avoiding a prolonged and unpredictable search for justice in a civilian court. In the government's very worst nightmare, Confederate sympathizing defense attorneys might have used these criminal trials to stir up support for Confederate causes. We'll see the same concerns exactly expressed by Allied powers in Nuremberg. The Allies' answer was, like here, to create a special commission court, one that could put strict limitations on the available defenses for Nazi defendants. As it turned out, the Booth conspiracy killed a president, but in so doing, it made Lincoln a martyr. Booth and his accomplices hoped to be remembered in the South as heroes, but largely their hopes were not realized. For most Southerners, the assassination plot was an embarrassment. Booth, a well-known actor himself, may have opened his own play in Ford's Theater that April night, and it certainly was dramatic, but it did not have the ending he hoped for, and few in his audience applauded his performance.
A few takeaways for me from the assassination. Mary Surratt became the first woman to be executed by the United States. And perhaps her greatest crime was when she learned that Booth had changed his mind about kidnapping Lincoln to killing him, that she did not come forth with that information and share it with authorities. How history might have been different if she had. The story of the trunks with the infected clothing was new to me. I had not heard that, but it reminded me of medieval siege warfare, where bodies of smallpox victims would be catapulted over city walls, hoping to infect the defenders. The role Jefferson Davis played is not proven, but it seems likely the Confederate government knew of the conspiracy, if not actually aiding and abetting it. And then finally, the controversy over whether a military court or a civil court was appropriate and proper. And as you know, the military tribunal was selected. The Allies faced a similar question at the end of World War II. Should the Nazi war criminals be tried in civil or military courts? And once again, the decision was to use military tribunals. And we face the same question with the suspected terrorists held at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. What was their status? And how should they be tried? I mention this because I'll bet both the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice, as they went through this controversial question, look back into history to see what illumination they could find to make the decisions in the present. And once again, military tribunals were chosen. Well, observations, comments, run me down, something in QB. Next week, the trial of Louis Riel. We've never heard of Louis Riel, but you're going to find out that every Canadian has. As always, thanks for coming.